I'll let you know as soon as it's up.
Okay.
Okay, you should be live.
Okay.
Yep.
All right. Good afternoon once again, everybody. It's great to have all of you here with us today. I'm so glad you've decided to join us for our discussion this afternoon about Israel. And what I'm going to try to do today is I'm going to try and talk to you about Israel from a rather different perspective. The way I want to broach the subject today is the way Israel was perceived or had been perceived or has been perceived through the various administrations here in the United States. And then I want to wind up this afternoon talking to you a little bit about Israel and the diaspora and its relationship to the diaspora. One of the things I like to always say about Israel, when you talk about the difficulties that Israel faces or the situations that Israel faces, is I usually use the word it's complicated. And the reason I use that term is because we rarely go behind the scenes and look at any of the different factors or features as to why something appears to us in a given way. And that's kind of what I want to do this afternoon. I want to go behind the scenes and talk about some of the things that you probably were not aware of in terms of the relationships between Israel and the various administrations here in the United States, and how things turned out in a way that they turned out because of those relationships. So I want to start by going back to the administration of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And quite frankly, or bluntly, Franklin Roosevelt was not at all in favor of the creation of the state of Israel. Israel would not have been established had Roosevelt been in power during the critical post-war years. Remember, Roosevelt died April 12th, 1945. But Roosevelt wasn't alone in his hostility to an independent Jewish state. When the UN partition plan was brought to a vote at the General Assembly on November 29th, 1947, the American oil companies, dependent on Middle Eastern oil fields, lobbied desperately for anti-partition votes. The military and the foreign policy establishments in Israel, and by those I mean the State Department, the Pentagon, and the CIA, were all not in favor of the partition plan. And now that the Cold War had begun, the US and the Soviet Union were competing over influence and allegiances in the Middle East and all over the world, quite frankly. Secretary of Defense James Forrestal proclaimed no group in this country should be permitted to influence our policy to the point where it could endanger our national security. And Secretary of State George Marshall also voiced opposition to the UN partition plan. Marshall and most of the State Department were in favor of prolonging British rule under a United Nations trusteeship Marshall explained to Harry Truman, who succeeded Roosevelt, recognizing a Jewish state would alienate the Arab world. And yet, Truman decided to make a personal decision against the advice of his foreign policy and defense advisors. His decision was actually influenced, and this is what I mean by some of the behind the scenes kinds of things. His decision was influenced by an old friend of his, Edward Jacobson. He played a crucial role in convincing Truman to back the partition plan and to recognize Israel. Truman had become so irritated by the Zionist lobbyists that he gave instructions to not let them come into the White House. The decree applied to all, including Chaim Weizmann. And this is when Jacobson intervened and told Truman, "Your hero is Andrew Jackson. I have a hero too. He is the greatest Jew alive." And I'm talking about Chaim Weizmann. He's an old man and he's really quite sick. And he's traveled thousands of miles to see you. And now you're putting him off. This isn't like you, Harry. And Truman replied, "You bald-headed son of a bitch. You win. I'll see him." And among the issues discussed by Truman and Weizmann during that faithful meeting was the Negev Desert. In November 1947, the State Department, having been lobbied by the British government, had asked the Jewish Agency to abandon claims over the southern Negev. American representatives at the UN were even hinting that without this concession, they would abandon their support for the partition plan. Weizmann explained to Truman that the Arab states already had access to the Red Sea via Transjordan, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia. The Jewish state also needed such access as a gateway to Africa and Asia. Truman gave his consent and again imposed his will on his reluctant diplomats. When Dwight Eisenhower became president in 1953, his administration tried to undo the damages they deemed that the Truman administration had caused in the Arab world. Many in the administration thought that the US recognition of Israel had alienated the Arab states and helped the Soviet Union make progress in the Middle East. The US Embassy in Amman urged the Eisenhower administration to extort from Israel territorial concessions, a compromise between the 1947 partition plan and the 1949 armistice lines, the repatriation and/or compensation of Palestinian refugees, and the internationalization of Jerusalem. Other ambassadors throughout the Middle East warned the White House and the State Department that the United States' support for Israel would throw Arab countries into the arms of the Soviet Union. And in 1953, the Eisenhower administration strongly opposed Jewish immigration from the Soviet Union, claiming that that kind of immigration would alienate the Arabs and would not be economically sustainable. But the Eisenhower administration amply demonstrated its more balanced approach on at least two occasions. During the crisis of the Benot Yaakov Bridge in 1953, and in the wake of the Suez Crisis in 1956. The first crisis resulted from a water conflict between Israel and Syria. Israel had chosen the site known as the Benot Yaakov Bridge as a water intake for Israel's national water carrier. Syria opposed Israel's decision, claiming it breached the armistice agreements of 1949, since the bridge was in a demilitarized zone between Israel and Syria. When Syria brought its claim against Israel to the United Nations Security Council, the United States government sided with Syria. As for the Suez Crisis in 1956, the United States government threatened Israel with sanctions and retaliation, including Israel's removal from the UN, were Israel not to pull out from Sinai. In November 1954, the State Department conceived a plan codenamed Alpha, designed to reach a settlement between Israel, Egypt, and Jordan. The Alpha plan called for some Israeli territorial withdrawals from the 1949 armistice lines so as to increase the size of the West Bank to Jordan's benefit, and also to create a corridor between Egypt and Jordan in the southern Negev. Israel was also expected to accept 75,000 Palestinian refugees and let Jordan use its port of Haifa.
Somehow are not working correctly.
As for Egypt, it was supposed to open the Suez Canal to Israeli shipping. In addition, both Egypt and Jordan were expected to end the boycott of Israel, but the Alpha plan was shelved in 1955 because Nasser asked for the entire Negev south of the Beersheba, not only the small corridor that the Americans had suggested. Eisenhower thought that he could halt Soviet advances in the Middle East by brokering an agreement between Egypt and Israel. In 1956, Eisenhower announced he was sending his emissary, Robert Anderson, to the Middle East to mediate between the two countries. Anderson's 3-month mission failed. Nasser was actively backing pro-Soviet rebellions in the Middle East, and Ben-Gurion rejected the proposition that Israel was an occupier in the territories it had conquered beyond the 1947 UN partition plan. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union kept making gains in the Middle East, and in November of 1956, Syria signed a pact with the Soviet Union. In July 1958, a pro-Nasserist coup in Iraq eliminated the royal family and aligned with the Soviet Union. Nasser was also encouraging rebellion against the Christian government in Lebanon and the Hashemite monarchy in Jordan. America was losing the Middle East. Eisenhower and Dulles' strategy had obviously failed. But after the coup in Iraq, the US sent Marines to Beirut, and the United Kingdom reinforced its military presence in Jordan. American foreign policy toward Israel and the Middle East started to change. From 1958 onward, Abba Eban remarked, Israel was now being treated not as a burden to be chivalrously borne, but as a friend whose cooperation was worthy of respect. When the Kennedy administration came to be in 1962, the United States reassessed its Middle East policy. John Kennedy was actually the first American president who spoke of a special relationship between the United States and Israel. He was also the first president to end the military embargo his predecessors had imposed on Israel. Kennedy approved of the sale of Hawk missiles to Israel, something Eisenhower had refused to do. There are some historians that have claimed that Kennedy had allowed the supply of US weaponry to Israel to dissuade it from purchasing its suspended nuclear program. But this doesn't seem to be backed up by any empirical evidence. In any case, the United States failed to block Israel's alleged nuclear program. Israel agreed to American inspections at its French-built nuclear reactor in Dimona, but Israel also kept fooling United States inspectors during their visits. President Kennedy was so frustrated by Israel's cat and mouse game the United States inspectors in the summer of 1963 that he warned Ben-Gurion with a strongly worded letter the United States commitment to Israel would be imperiled were the United States government fail to obtain reliable information on Israel's nuclear activities. And yet Kennedy never took any strong practical measures to impede Israel's alleged nuclear program, which became a matter of public speculation on June 14, 1967, with the publication of the New York Times article, which said, Israel said to plan to make the atom bomb. When Lyndon Johnson became president, after the Kennedy assassination in November 1963, he increased America's military supplies to Israel in response to the strengthening of military relations between the Soviet Union and Egypt. In 1964, the Soviet Union and Egypt had signed an additional $500 million military deal. In December 1963, the Pentagon wrote that the previous US policies in the Middle East had not prevented the flow of Soviet weaponry to Egypt, Syria, and Iraq, and therefore United States military supplies to Israel were now justified. Nasser became so involved in supporting anti-American forces in the Middle East, especially in Yemen, from 1962 onward, that the United States decided to sever its diplomatic relations with Egypt in 1965. It was in this context that Israel's Prime Minister, Levi Eshkol, paid an official visit to the United States in June 1964. Eshkol was the first prime minister to be officially invited to the White House. And during Eshkol's visit to the United States, President Johnson invited him to tour his Texas ranch. The Israeli diplomat Yehuda Avner, who was also present, wrote of that experience in his book, The Prime Ministers. He said, the president gunned his vehicle down rutted dirt tracks, causing us to bounce crazily about. As we approached one particular pasture, a cluster of cows bolted in alarm at the sight of us, leaving just one cow that stubbornly refused to move. The president honked his horn and nudged it with his vehicle fender until it too skedaddled. That's Daisy, Johnson roared with laughter. She's as pig-headed as a Texas senator with colic. Holding firmly onto his Hamburg for fear it might fly off, Eshkol looked inquiringly at Dr. Herzog, and above the growl of the engine asked, "Was redt der Goy?" Yiddish for, what's this Goy talking about? For Israel, Eshkol's visit to the United States was timely since the alliance with France was by now reaching its limits. In 1965, the United States decided to supply Israel with advanced weapons while cutting down its wheat supply to Egypt. By the time the Six-Day War erupted in June 1967, Israel and the United States had become allies. In September 1969, the first US Phantom fighter jets arrived in Israel. France was no longer selling its Dassault-made jets due to the embargo de Gaulle had imposed. Thus, the transition in the Israel Air Force from French fighter jets to American ones had begun. Johnson was also eventually to abandon his demand that Israel signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty as a condition for their supply. Richard Nixon became president in 1969, the year of the pro-Soviet coup in Libya. This event was a reminder of the danger of Soviet expansionism in North Africa and in the Middle East. While Nixon maintained an alliance with Israel, there were two opposing approaches in his administration regarding the Israeli-Arab conflict. Secretary of State William Rogers blamed the Arab-Israeli conflict for the Soviet involvement in the Middle East, while the National Security Advisor, Henry Kissinger, blamed Soviet involvement in the Middle East for the continuation of the Arab-Israeli conflict. For Rogers, solving the Arab-Israeli conflict would reduce the Arab temptation to invite Soviet influence into the Middle East. The Rogers Plan, which was made official in December 1969, called for an Israeli withdrawal to the 1967 lines, including the West Bank, but only in exchange for some commitment to peace. Countering this plan, Henry Kissinger contended that in order to improve the chances of reaching an agreement between Israel and its Arab neighbors, the United States first had to reduce Soviet influence in the Middle East. This could be achieved, Kissinger argued, by convincing Arab states such as Egypt that they could only recover land via US pressures on Israel and not via Soviet weaponry. Kissinger wanted to make Israeli concessions concomitant to a reduced Soviet influence in the Middle East. The September 1970 war between Jordan and the PLO was a reminder of the Middle East's Cold War polarization. The United States and Israel backed Jordan, while the Soviet Union and Syria supported the PLO. President Nixon personally thanked Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir for Israel's key role in helping King Hussein thwart the Soviet-backed Syrian takeover of his kingdom. The 1970 crisis in Jordan tended to confirm Kissinger's analysis that Soviet influence was a major obstacle to Middle East peace, and Kissinger finally gained the upper hand when he replaced Rogers as Secretary of State in September 1973. Within 2 weeks of Kissinger's swearing in, though, the Yom Kippur War broke out, and the Middle East was ablaze. The Yom Kippur War was both a regional and international watershed that modified the United States' attitude towards the Middle East and Israel. Until the Yom Kippur War, United States diplomacy was mostly focused on ending the war in Vietnam, on negotiating arms control agreements with the Soviet Union, and on establishing relations with communist China. The Yom Kippur War was a painful reminder of how deeply United States interests could be affected by the Middle East conflict. The war turned into a proxy conflict between the two superpowers. Both the United States and the Soviet Union supplied their Middle East allies during the war, and both put their own forces on high alert. The war also generated an oil embargo that skyrocketed oil prices, thus disrupting the world economy and vital United States interests. Most of America's assumptions on the Middle East were challenged by the Yom Kippur War. The United States had presumed that Israel's military superiority would deter any Arab attack, that the Arab states would not use their oil cartel as a tool for political extortion, and the Soviet influence was in decline. Yet all these assumptions proved wrong. After the war, Egyptian President Anwar Sadat fully understood that Israel could be dealt a blow, but could not be defeated militarily. He was therefore willing to explore the diplomatic option via the United States, which might be more useful to Egypt than the military alliance with the Soviet Union. For the sake of recuperating the Sinai Peninsula, Sadat was willing to switch Egypt's Cold War alliance from the Soviet Union to the United States, but he wanted to be sure that the United States could deliver. A master of realpolitik, Kissinger needed no further explanation. The October 24th, 1973 ceasefire agreement between Israel and Egypt had left Israeli troops on the western shore of the Suez Canal. Sadat wanted an additional agreement that would involve a significant Israeli withdrawal from the Sinai Peninsula. while Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin was willing to cooperate with Kissinger in order to pull Egypt out of the Soviet sphere of influence, he was not willing to pay the territorial price demanded by Sadat and acquiesced to by Kissinger. Yet this was what Rabin ended up accepting under the pressure of President Gerald Ford, who of course had replaced Nixon after his resignation in August of 1974. Ford even threatened to reassess the United States-Israeli relationship with Israel if Israel were to reject the United States' demand for an Israeli redeployment in the Sinai Peninsula. Ford and Kissinger were determined to impose a second disengagement agreement on Israel because they were convinced that the United States needed to, at least partially, end the oil embargo. In addition, the United States was encountering major international setbacks. Turkey's invasion of northern Cyprus in 1974, Communist North Vietnam's invasion of South Vietnam in 1975, and the corresponding collapse of the Vietnam Peace Accords. And Kissinger thought he had to prove to Sadat that America could deliver. Rabin had been coerced into the 1975 interim agreement with Egypt, but at least he shared Kissinger's objection and subscribed to his strategy. With the election of Jimmy Carter in 1976, however, Kissinger's realpolitik was replaced by a vastly different approach. Unlike his predecessors, Carter was willing to engage the Soviet Union, including in the Middle East. In addition, Carter's approach to foreign policy was influenced by his religious belief and his commitment to human rights. During his meeting with Yitzhak Rabin at the White House in 1977, Carter insisted that he considered the Palestinian issue to be one of human rights, and that in his view, negotiating with the PLO was inevitable. This was the first time that a US president called for negotiations between Israel and the PLO. On borders, Carter was of the opinion that Israel should withdraw to the 1949 armistice lines, thus allowing for the establishment of a Palestinian state in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip with minor territorial changes. Finally, Carter considered the Palestinian issue to be the core source of the Arab-Israeli conflict. 3 months after the Carter-Rabin meeting in Washington, Menachem Begin won the 1977 election and became Prime Minister of Israel. Carter and Begin's personality and respective stances could not have been more at odds. Their meeting at the White House in 1977 was tragicomic. According to Begin's advisor, Yehuda Avner, Begin spoke with much pathos about the Holocaust and about the Jews' historical rights in the biblical land of Israel. Carter had other ideas in mind: the PLO and the 1949 armistice lines. The clash between the two leaders reached a climax as there was silence that settled over the chamber. The tick of the antique clock on the marble mantelpiece became audible. An eternity seemed to hang between each tick. All the president's men lowered their eyes, and when Carter finally asked Begin if he'd be willing to negotiate with the PLO, if the PLO were to recognize Israel and fully endorse Resolution 242 and 338, Begin shouted back, "No, absolutely no." Pressed on the recognition issue by the US National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski, Begin retorted, "The United States' affirmation of Israel's right to exist is not a favor, nor is it a negotiable concession. I shall not negotiate my existence with anybody, and I need nobody's affirmation of it." While the Carter administration was widely credited for the peace agreement, the achievement was overshadowed by 3 international fiascos for the United States, all of which occurred in 1979. The Islamic Revolution in Iran, accompanied by the assault on the American embassy in Tehran, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, and the communist coup in Nicaragua. Carter was defeated in the 1980 presidential elections. By the time Carter left office in January 1981, the Camp David Agreement had been implemented with regard to Egypt, but not with regard to Palestinian autonomy. For Begin, Ronald Reagan's election victory was a relief because, unlike Carter, Reagan wanted to defeat the Soviet Union, and he had no intention of engaging the Soviet allies, such as the PLO. And yet Begin overestimated the change. In 1981, the Reagan administration signed a memorandum of understanding on strategic cooperation with Israel, an agreement that established joint military exercises aimed at deterring Soviet threats. But it also sold AWAC fighter jets to Saudi Arabia. Israel was greatly concerned by America's delivery of technologically advanced fighter jets to Saudi Arabia, an Arab country officially at war with Israel. Yet Saudi Arabia was a US ally against the Soviet Union, and thwarting Soviet influence was Reagan's priority. US interest in the Middle East did not rely on Israel alone. When the United States condemned Israel for annexing the Golan Heights in 1981, Begin summoned the US ambassador, literally yelling at him, "What do you mean the US is considering punishing Israel for annexing the Golan? Are we a vassal state of yours, or a banana republic, or a misbehaved child that deserves spanking?" The 1982 Lebanon War would genuinely foment tensions between the Reagan administration and the Begin government. On August 12, 1982, Reagan expressed outrage over Israel's latest bombing raids in Beirut, saying that the attacks had resulted in needless destruction and bloodshed. The Lebanon War was also affected Israel's image in the United States. It was the first Middle East war covered by CNN, with devastating effects on Israel's public image. In September 1982, Reagan announced his administration's peace initiative for the Middle East, declaring the departure of Palestinians from Beirut dramatizes more than ever the homelessness of the Palestinian people. Palestinians feel strongly that their cause is more than a question of refugees. I agree. Because the Reagan announcement hinted at Palestinian statehood, an angry Menachem Begin rejected Reagan's initiative. 6 years later, in the wake of the failed London Agreement and the beginning of the First Intifada, the Reagan administration initiated contacts with the PLO despite Israel's vocal protest. At the same time, Reagan was a staunch advocate for the rights of Soviet Jews to immigrate to Israel. He broached the issue of Soviet Jewry during his meeting with Gorbachev in Reykjavik in October 1986, and would continue to do so in subsequent discussions with the Soviet leaders. Despite these and other disagreements, the Cold War made Israel an indisputable US ally in the Middle East. So, as the Soviet threat withered, so did Israel's strategic importance. Hence, was the Bush administration's less forgiving toward Israel. When in 1990, Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir formed a narrow right-wing coalition, United States Secretary of State James Baker publicly accused Israel of not wanting peace. In June 1990, Baker told the House of Representatives Foreign Affairs Committee that were Shamir interested in peace, he should call the White House. I have to tell you that everybody over there should know the telephone number. is 1202-456-1414. When you're serious about peace, call us. As the Baker-Shamir relationship continued to deteriorate, the unexpected happened. Iraq invaded Kuwait in August of 1990, and the ensuing Gulf War began in early 1991. Iraq launched 39 Scud missiles at Israel, and all the while the United States requested that Israel not retaliate. The Bush administration feared that an Israeli retaliation would undermine its military coalition that encompassed Arab countries such as Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Syria, a coalition the United States had painfully built. Going against his own principles and ideology, Shamir decided to accede to the request and not retaliate. An uneasy act of political realism that Shamir described in his memoirs. He said, "I can think of nothing that went more against my grain as a Jew and a Zionist, nothing more opposed to the ideology on which my life has been based than the decision I took in the crisis preceding the Gulf War, to ask the people of Israel to accept the burden of restraint in the face of attack." Israel's Labor Party, which undoubtedly benefited from the crisis and from the bewilderment of many Israeli voters, won the general election in June 1992. A senior aide to Yitzhak Shamir claimed that Labor leader Shimon Peres had asked the Bush administration not to unconditionally agree to a loan guarantee in order to improve the Labor Party's chances in Israel's 1992 elections. Foreign Minister Moshe Ahrens then accused the Bush administration of interfering in the Israeli diplomatic political arena in an undisguised attempt to bring down the democratically elected government of Israel in order to further a policy of its own. The tension between the Bush administration and the Shamir government was unprecedented. So was James Baker's decision to bar Benjamin Netanyahu, then serving as deputy foreign minister, from the State Department. At the same time, George Bush had always willingly used his influence as vice president and as president to convince Ethiopian as well as Soviet leaders to let their Jewish citizens emigrate to Israel. The animosity between George Bush and Yitzhak Shamir was replaced in 1993 by a close friendship between Bill Clinton and Yitzhak Rabin. While the Oslo agreements were originally brokered by Norway, they were originally signed in Washington. The Declaration of Principles was originally supposed to be signed in Washington between Israel and Minister Shimon Peres and the PLO official Mahmoud Abbas. But the Clinton administration decided to invite both Rabin and Arafat. Rabin first demurred, but then he decided to fly to Washington on a plane donated by Saddam Hussein. The aircraft was hurriedly painted with Algerian colors, since Iraqi planes were banned from the United States. President Clinton personally orchestrated the historic handshake between Rabin and Arafat, and he built a unique friendship with Yitzhak Rabin. Clinton, whose eulogy of Rabin, when he says Shalom Chaver, goodbye friend, was heartfelt and memorable, would later describe the announcement of Rabin's assassination as maybe the worst day that I ever had at the White House. Bill Clinton's personal involvement in the negotiations between Israel and the Palestinian Authority culminated in the failed Camp David conference in July 2000. The defeat was personally humiliating to Clinton. When Arafat called Clinton to wish him well before the end of his presidency, and he praised him as a great president, Clinton replied, "I'm a colossal failure, and you are the one who made me one." In light of Bill Clinton's Middle East setback, his successor, George W. Bush, who took office in January 2001, was not eager to risk his own credibility by brokering the Arab-Israeli conflict. Yet, the 9/11 terrorist attack forced him to deal with this complicated region. Meanwhile, administration officials disagreed strongly about how to handle the Middle East. Secretary of State Colin Powell thought the United States needed to solve the Arab-Israeli conflict in order to tame the Arab world's anti-Americanism. Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, on the other hand, argued that the United States could not bridge the gap between Israel and the Palestinians without defeating radical Islamism and without neutralizing the Iranian nuclear threat, because in his view, the Palestinians were unlikely to make concessions as long as they could rely on Iranian support and might. As then, National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice would write of the tensions within the Bush administration. She said the differences in the administration between the decidedly pro-Israel bent of the White House and the State Department's more traditional pro-Arab view percolated constantly beneath the surface. Then came the Iraq War in 2003. Just as in 1991, George Bush had convinced Arab countries to join the US-led coalition against Saddam Hussein by committing to a peace initiative on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict immediately following the Gulf War, George W. Bush promised Arab leaders he would undertake a serious effort on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict after the ousting of Saddam Hussein. After the invasion of Iraq and the fall of Saddam Hussein in 2003, Bush did indeed show determination about handling the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. In April of 2003, the Bush administration released the final draft of the Middle East Roadmap for Peace, which called for the establishment of a Palestinian state by 2005. In May 2003, the Israeli government announced its acceptance of the roadmap, but with preconditions. The establishment of a Palestinian state had to be preceded by a proven Palestinian commitment to an eradication of terrorism and to functioning institutions. In December 2003, however, Ariel Sharon announced that Israel would unilaterally withdraw from the Gaza Strip and try to convince the Bush administration to endorse his initiative. Upon hearing of Sharon's intention to unilaterally withdraw from Gaza, Condoleezza Rice said that she was stunned. Sharon's successor, Ehud Olmert, had won the 2006 elections on a platform to pursue unilateral withdrawal from most of the West Bank. Yet Olmert's tenure began with a war against Hezbollah in Lebanon, which reminded Israelis of the danger of unilateralism. Israel had unilaterally withdrawn from southern Lebanon in 2000. Hezbollah had filled the vacuum, and Israel was now paying the price of that policy. Olmert subsequently abandoned the pursuit of unilateralism and agreed to renew negotiations with the Palestinian Authority in 2007. The negotiations were hosted by the Bush administration in Annapolis, thus bringing President Bush to the point he wanted to avoid in his inauguration in January of 2001, direct US involvement in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. In December 2006, the Iraq Study Group report was published, co-chaired by former Secretary of State James Baker and by former Congressman Lee Hamilton. The report claimed that the United States could not win the war in Iraq and preserve the interests in the Middle East without solving the Arab-Israeli conflict. In August 2007, two American scholars, John Mersheimer and Stephen Walt, published The Israeli Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy, a book that accused AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, of having excessive and damaging influence on the United States foreign policy. This accusation was somewhat reminiscent of the Eisenhower administration's allegations back in 1953. U.S. foreign policy had to defend the national interest and could not let itself be influenced by pro-Israel lobby. While Barack Obama assumed office in 2009, he didn't necessarily subscribe to the Mearsheimer-Walt theory. He did adopt a more critical approach to Israel and its policies. Obama believed that full U.S. support made Israel less peace-prone, and that throwing daylight on the relationship would contribute to peace. Aiming to reset America's relations with the Arab world, he spoke in Cairo in June 2009, calling for improved understanding between the West and Islam, and reaffirming the administration's commitment to Palestinian statehood. Soon, however, the Arab world unraveled. What seemingly started as an Arab Spring in January 2011 turned into a general implosion of Arab states and to the expansion of the Islamic State in Iraq and in Syria. During his second term in office, President Obama focused on reining in Iran's nuclear ambitions through diplomacy. His administration initiated negotiations for a nuclear deal with Iran. Meanwhile, Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu vociferously criticized the planned Iran deal based on three arguments. One, the agreement did not block Iran's path to the nuclear bomb, but only bought time by pushing off by 10 years Iran's breakout time. Second, the agreement did not curb Iran's development of long-range missiles. And third, the agreement did not curb Iran's support for terrorist militias throughout the Middle East. In March 2015, Netanyahu openly made his case before two houses of Congress. Why should Iran's radical regime change for the better, Netanyahu asked, when it could enjoy the best of both worlds, aggression abroad and prosperity at home? That an Israeli prime minister addressed Congress to criticize the president's policies was unprecedented, and the Obama administration perceived it as an affront. At the same time, Netanyahu failed to convince 2/3 of Congress to block the deal Obama had negotiated. The Iran nuclear deal was signed on June 14, 2015. A year and a half later, in December 2016, the Obama administration did not veto UN Security Council Resolution 2334. The resolution constituted a serious drawback for Israel, as it undermined the flexibility of the earlier Resolution 242 by denying the legitimacy and legality of any Israeli sovereignty beyond the 1949 armistice line. Unsurprisingly, Israel was relieved by the change of guard at the White House in January 2017. President Donald Trump made three dramatic decisions that were warmly welcomed by the Israeli government. In May 2018, he announced the transfer of the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, as well as the U.S. withdrawal from the nuclear deal. And in March 2019, he recognized Israel's sovereignty over the Golan Heights. Despite ups and downs over the last 5 decades, the United States-Israel relationship has been fairly stable in, I think, 2 areas. 1, military aid, and 2, in public opinion. Each year, the United States provides Israel with financial assistance of $3 billion. But what you may not be aware of is that part of this agreement says that 3/4 of the $3 billion must be spent on U.S. military equipment and services. As valuable as this is to Israel's economy, the assistance also benefits American military industry and helps the United States improve its defense capabilities in the Middle East. Another constant in the US-Israel relations is the support of public opinion. A Gallup poll established in March 2018 found that 74% of Americans have a favorable opinion of Israel. That is the highest figure since the early 1990s. And this favorable opinion is higher among Republicans, 83%, than among Democrats at 64%. According to the poll report, Republicans have consistently shown greater support than Democrats for Israel, partly because of conservative Christian beliefs about the biblical significance of Israel. The poll also found 2/3 of Americans sympathize more with Israel than with the Palestinians. So that gives you an idea of the ups and downs, the ins and outs, the conflicts and the agreements between just the administrations of the United States and the Israeli government from 1953 to the present. But I don't think it would be fair to leave you with just that idea. I think you also need to hear about some of the disagreements and difficulties that are faced because of what we call the diaspora. When we refer to the diaspora, we're referring to all of the Jews that live outside of Israel. In the 1950s, there was very little criticism of Israel among American Jews. The main contentious issue was the claim generally made by Israeli leaders that all diaspora Jews were living in exile. Yet, the 1956 Suez War was the first war fought by Israel without the full support of American Jews, because this war was not unanimously perceived as defensive. Abba Eban noted that with the 1956 war, for the first time in our history, there was reluctance to justify Israel's actions without reserve. Unease and criticism widened with subsequent military conflicts. Images of the First Lebanon War in 1982 and then of the First Intifada in 1988 made many American Jews uncomfortable and increasingly critical of Israel. Among the many examples of this sort of family feud was an exchange of letters in January 1988 between the then president of what was the UAHC, the Union of American Hebrew Congregations, which is now the URJ, the Union of Reform Judaism, the Reform Movement's congregational arm. Rabbi Alexander Schindler and the president of Israel, Chaim Herzog, had this exchange of letters. And in his response to Schindler, who criticized Israel's handling of the Intifada, Herzog wrote, "Jewish ethics and morals which you evoke are very clear as to one's duty to defend oneself when facing possible mortal danger. Israel and US Jewry have also been at odds on religious matters. Most American Jews are not Orthodox. And the United States, which by and large upholds church-state separation, recognizes life cycle ceremonies officiated by representatives of all the major Jewish movements. By contrast, in Israel, the Orthodox rabbinate currently wields a monopoly over religious matters, and as a result, the state of Israel only recognizes Orthodox conversions and Orthodox marriages. Reform and conservative marriages and Reform and conservative conversions in Israel are deemed invalid. Meanwhile, many Israelis also contest and criticize the Orthodox religious monopoly, which does not reflect the pluralism of Israeli society. Prayer at the Western Wall, or you might know it as the Wailing Wall, has also become contentious. The Orthodox rabbinate, which runs the Western Wall and its plaza, only allows services according to Orthodox customs, including and allowing men to pray according to customary Orthodox Jewish ritual and rites. The police forcibly remove women who wear tefillin or a talit, or who read from a Torah scroll at the plaza, because Israeli law states that worshipers and visitors at holy sites, whether Jewish, Muslim, or Christian, must respect the customs and practices of these sites. It's only in recent years have some women, known as women of the wall, tried to introduce new practices at the Western Wall, something the ultra-Orthodox perceive as a violation of the site's customs and practices, and therefore of the law. Furthermore, the ultra-Orthodox onlookers often verbally and physically attack the women of the wall. To most American Jews, as well as many Israelis, images of police forcefully removing Jewish women from the wall plaza are intolerable. Even some American Orthodox rabbis have protested the Orthodox rabbinate's heavy-handed policy. Many in Israel have raised their voice against the banning of women of the wall. Each year now, female members of the Knesset join the women of the wall, thus preventing police arrests. The Israeli diaspora relationship, though, is characterized not only by a widening political divide among American Jews, but also by a demographic difference between Israel and United States Jewry. When Israel declared its independence in 1948, its population constituted only a small fraction of what remained of the Jewish people after the Holocaust. Today, most Jews still live outside of Israel, about 58%. But Israel has the world's largest Jewish community, over 6 million. Israel is the only country in the world where the Jewish population is growing because of a high birth rate, because of aliyah, immigration to Israel, and a near absence of intermarriage. In the rest of the world, by contrast, the Jewish population is shrinking because of assimilation and intermarriage. This tendency is especially true in the United States, where 40% of world Jewry lives, and it influences the relationship between Israel and the United States Jewry because, as shown by recent surveys, support for Israel among American Jews tends to be proportional to their levels of religious observance. The more Orthodox they are, the more support they get or they give to Israel, and vice versa. At the same time, though, Reform and conservative and other liberal Jews have strong ties to Israel, individually as well as organizationally. For example, ARTSA, the Association of Reform Zionists of America, and their criticism is meant to be constructive. In June 2017, the Israeli government, pressured by ultra-Orthodox parties, backed out of an agreement with the American conservative and reform movements to expand non-Orthodox prayer areas at the Western Wall Plaza, a decision that appalled most American Jews. In April of 2018, following the harsh criticism of his hardcore electorate, Prime Minister Netanyahu scrapped a deal which had been partially motivated by a willingness to assuage the criticism of American Jewry that would have legalized the status of some illegal African migrants and asylum seekers in Israel. Jewish organizations in the United States also highly criticized the Knesset in August 2018, when they set forth their nation state basic law, which specifies that the state of Israel is the nation state of the Jewish people. It's these kinds of developments which point to an ever widening ideological gap between Israel and United States Jewry. In 2019, veteran Washington journalist Jonathan Weissman expressed this concern in a New York Times op-ed titled, "American Jews and Israeli Jews are headed for a messy breakup." Weissman suggests that Israel seems to have given up on liberal American Jews. Israel politicians and citizens are increasingly dismissive of American Jews anyway. Evangelical Christians, ardently pro-Israel, give Jerusalem a power base in Washington that is larger and stronger than the American Jewish population. And with Orthodox American Jews aligned with evangelicals, that coalition has at least an interfaith veneer. Even without conservative and Reform Jews, the bulk of American Jewry. Weissman mentioned that his rabbi had recently asked his congregation to act and save Israel from itself, to which US-born Israeli author Daniel Gordis replied, "If American Jewish progressives want Israelis to be in dialogue with them, it's time to end the assumption that the repository of morality, wisdom, and decency resides exclusively on the western edge of the Atlantic." But there are other US Israeli-born rabbis and thinkers who have kept their original outlook. For most Israelis, these social and religious issues are less important than security. Even secular Israelis are generally indifferent to the monopoly of Orthodox customs at the Western Wall. When it comes down to security, mainstream Israelis are still willing to consider a two-state solution, but they also believe that the solution is not feasible in the foreseeable future because of Palestinian rejectionism. In theory, then, mainstream Israelis would not take issue with the statement of the Union of Reform Judaism and the Central Conference of American Rabbis that, and I quote, "The ongoing failure to establish a viable peace poses security and other risks to Israel and is a disservice to those Palestinians who deserve a peaceful future for their children and grandchildren." But the same mainstream Israelis would point to what is missing in this statement, and that is that for the past 8 decades, from the Peel Plan to the 2008 Olmert proposal, Palestinian leaders have rejected territorial compromise with Zionism in any shape or form, regardless of the size and location of Jewish settlements. Hence, the inattentive dialogue between Israeli and American Jews. The latter tend to think that the Israelis are not truly interested in peace, while the former strongly feel that they are the ones suffering from the absence of peace and that their past efforts to achieve peace are too often overlooked. Israel has always valued its relationship with American Jews, not least because of their political influence in the United States. This influence, however, is increasingly split, and I think will increasingly continue to be split along religious and political lines. Well, I hope that through my remarks this afternoon, or via my remarks this afternoon, you've gotten somewhat of a flavor of some of the difficulties that behind the scenes activities seem to place on Israel, and also of some of the unfortunate events that had taken place when it seemed that at least the possibility there were peaceful solutions that might have been at hand. I know we're well beyond the time that I was supposed to speak, but if you have any questions, I'll be more than happy to answer, or at least try to answer any of the questions that my talk might have propagated.
Rabbi, I have a question. Do you know anything about the current state of the, I don't want to say agreement, but the memorandum to normalize relations that the Trump administration entered into with, I think, Bahrain and the UAE?
Right. The things, the couple of things that have taken place or that are in the works for taking place are things like business agreements, trade, as well as tourism. Those are the things that are top on the list of those agreements. Although, if you happen to read the paper this morning, you will have noted that Ben Gurion Airport is closed down because of COVID-19. So I think they're closed down until March, and they're not bringing in any. There is no tourism right now from anywhere, and there's very little trade that's taking place except within the world of shipping and on the sea. There's no air freight that's being brought in. So as far as I understood those agreements to be, the normalization was to take place with those two things first, and then other things were to be under discussion at a later date.
Do you view that as a good thing?
I do.
Yeah.
I view it as a good thing. I don't view it necessarily as the achievement that the Trump administration viewed it. Since the UAE and Israel were not at war with each other, so to say that they've now negotiated a peace agreement, I'm not exactly sure what that means. I mean, they simply existed in different worlds. They didn't really do very much with each other. But I do think any agreement that brings about some kind of normalization of relationship between Israel and any countries in the Arab world, I think certainly will have a positive effect on the future, and hopefully it will lead to other things. So yeah, I do consider it a good thing. I just don't consider it the be all and the end all of the peace agreement that they made it out to be.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Sure.
I have two related kind of questions. One is, I was curious as to what you thought of Bibi, given his own legal issues and governmental issues. And the other half of that is, because he didn't get a clear majority, he needed to form a coalition with the ultra-Orthodox.
Right.
And so is there any possibility that someone could win a future election where they might not need to have a coalition, and some of the issues with the ultra-Orthodox in Israel might dissipate?
Okay, as far as Bibi is concerned, as he has continued to lead Israel as prime minister, he has become more and more and more against or opposed to any kind of normalization of the relationship between Israel and the Palestinians. And that's because, I mean, it's understood that that's because of his relationship with the ultra-Orthodox parties. And the reason he takes that stand and the ultra-Orthodox parties take that stand is because of the settlements that exist in the West Bank or in Jerusalem and on the West Bank. The result of which would be the dismantling, if there was any kind of a state, a Palestinian state that was set up, it would generally mean the dismantling of those settlements that exist on the West Bank. Now, personally, to me, just me, my opinion, I think that would be a great idea to dismantle them and bring them back into Israel proper. There's plenty of land in Israel to give them land to exist. I think one of the best things that could happen to Israel for security and for the future of Israel would be to allow the Palestinians to have their own state. I'm very much for a two-state solution. As far as Netanyahu's legal difficulties, you probably know that his trials have been postponed because of COVID-19. There's pretty much a lockdown right now in Israel because of COVID-19, and basically, as of now, he's dissolved the government because he hasn't even been able to come to an agreement with the ultra-Orthodox parties. So there will be another election in Israel. This will be the fourth election or the fifth election in the last few years. Do I think what I think is that some of the minority parties in Israel need to step up, and they need to form a coalition that's both a coalition that confronts the issue of security, as well as confronts the issue of what Israel is as a nation, as a democratic nation. It's very difficult to look at Israel as both a democracy and a theocracy at the same time. And I think that's not what Israel was set up to be. I mean, if you look at not the founders of Israel, but if you look at the founders of Zionism, I mean, they were not only were they not interested in religion, they were anti-religion. So they tried to bring about a democracy in Israel that was set up for all people, that would make all people equal under the law. It's real. One of the modern problems of Israel, or that Israel keeps running up against, is trying to figure out, are you settling disputes within society by halakha, by Jewish law, or are you allowing the Israeli Supreme Court to settle disputes that go on within Israel in a democratic fashion? I mean, I think that is the sum of the difficulties that Israel is facing now, societally and politically.
Thank you.
Hopefully that answered part of your question.
It did. Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions?
Yes, Rabbi, I'd like to tell you a little bit about an experience Paul and I had. This was during the Barack Obama administration, when they were debating the deal with Iran.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a lot of, it was at the time a very high feeling. So we went to what was supposed to be an interview and discussion with an Israeli journalist at a large Orthodox synagogue, modern Orthodox, Beth Tfilah Synagogue, one of the largest and most influential in the United States, actually. And so the woman who sort of masqueraded as a journalist, it turned out was formerly on Bibi's security staff. And I have never heard such invective used against a president of the United States, even in this past election we've had here. Mm-hmm. And this was on the bima of an Orthodox synagogue. And this woman called Barack Obama a liar, a cheat. She even called him an anti-Semite. And here's a guy whose chief of staff was the grandson of an Irgun, an Irgun general.
Really?
And Paul and I were looking at each other like, what crazy world have we just entered into? Especially when she got a standing ovation.
Really? Really? I'm surprised.
So good.
I'm really that's surprising. I mean, one of the things to me about Israel is that Israel's like a family member. You can love a family member and still disagree with them. And up until the last couple of years, the last few years, I think that's been the relationship between the diaspora and Israel, and it's been a good relationship. I think up till not that it's been perfect, not that they've always loved what Israel's done, and not that Israel's always loved what the diaspora stands for. But I think up until maybe 2018, 2019, you had that kind of a relationship. But since then, I think the relationship, unfortunately, has really begun to turn sour. And I think it's because of this hard and fast ideology that the Netanyahu government puts forth, that it has to be my way or the highway. It has to be our way. There are lots of ways to achieve security, not just one, not just the way that they see. So I think it's unfortunate that we've begun to come to this point.
Rabbi?
Yep.
Is there any demographic data about the settlements and whether or not they are predominantly Orthodox or conservative?
No, they're all Orthodox. They are all Haredi, ultra Orthodox.
They really are.
All
Okay.
of them.
Wouldn't be there.
Mhm.
None of them identify with any other sect in Judaism other than Haredi Judaism.
Oh, that's interesting. I didn't know that at all. And I can understand the concept of not wanting to give up the settlements because of the size of Israel and of giving up territory, and because Israel is so small to begin with. On the other hand, I also agree a great deal with you about having a two-state solution, and that might be the only way to peace. But it also is a little disturbing to think of the concept of taking away the settlements, destroying the settlements completely, and moving people out. Couldn't it be possible to move people out if it came to a two-state solution, but leave the settlements for the ability for other people, Palestinians, to move into them, so that there would be habitation for them?
Is that yeah, sure. That's certainly possible. I think
happened. They
probably
destroyed everything. They destroyed the greenhouses. They destroyed everything.
it probably would not be a bad idea to leave the physicality of what's already there.
Right.
But the problem is that the people who reside on the settlements, they when I say that they're Haredi, what I mean by that is they take the position that land was given to them by God,
Mm-hmm.
and that the Palestinians nor anybody else has any connection to that land. That land was a promise to them by God. You know the song where the verse says, "This land is mine. God gave this land to me." Okay, Exodus. That's how they really feel, and they unfortunately are willing to fight to the death to keep that land as a promise from God. Remember, you have people who in Israel, the Haredim, who believe that this is a promise, a biblical promise, and they live on the basis of this biblical promise. And then you have the actual state of Israel, which was, set up as a compromise in 1948. So when they talk about the lines, the 1947 lines, 1949 lines, they're all talking about certain pieces that need to go back to their owner, their original owner. And Israel is unwilling to do that, partially because they've given up land. They gave back the entire Sinai Peninsula that they captured during the Yom Kippur War. So it's not as if Israel has never done the right thing and given up land for peace or tried to trade land for peace. It's that they're at a point now where they're not willing to give up very much. I think, if the right leadership came along, they would be willing to give up. They would be willing to give up the West Bank and Gaza. I mean, they've already given up Gaza, but I think they'd be willing to give up the West Bank. But I think you'd need the right leadership creating the right proposal. And that's what hasn't been found yet. Any other questions?